The new girl won't last a week. That's what Dr. Sterling had announced to the entire physician station on Katie Morrison's first shift, his voice carrying across the emergency department like he was calling odds at a racetrack. His smirk widened when the other doctors laughed. Nobody at Oak Creek Memorial knew why he'd made that prediction with such certainty. Nobody knew about the 3 billing discrepancies Katie had already flagged in her first month. Nobody knew that those discrepancies, if left unchecked, would eventually lead to questions about phantom procedures and kickback arrangements with medical supply companies worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 annually. What Sterling didn't know was that Katie Morrison had walked through worse than a hospital with corrupt infrastructure. What he didn't know was waiting in room 304. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar antiseptic song as Katie pushed the medication cart down the corridor at 06 for 5 hours, her worn scrubs moving with practiced efficiency. The fabric hung loose on her frame, deliberate. Less noticeable that way. The limp in her left leg was minimal now, barely perceptible unless you knew what you were looking for, unless you understood that shrapnel from an IED in Sangin Valley didn't leave your body quietly. It left fragments. Memories. Tremors in hands that needed to stay steady. Katie kept her eyes down as she navigated the hallway, her badge clipped to her chest, the name Morrison printed in standard hospital font below her credentials. Just a name. Nothing more. Break came at 0710. The break room was empty, most of the day shift nurses hadn't arrived yet. Katie opened locker 23 and stared at the pair of boots resting on the lower shelf. They were caked with dust from the Helmand province, the laces still knotted from the last time she'd laced them in 2019. The leather was cracked, split in places, the soles worn thin enough that you could feel the ground through them. She reached out and touched the right boot with the tips of her fingers, the way someone might touch a photograph of a person they couldn't talk about anymore. The fabric of her scrub sleeve pulled up slightly, revealing the edge of a scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. Old scar. Surgical. She pulled the sleeve back down, glanced at the locker room door, then closed the metal compartment with a soft clang. The sound echoed slightly. Too loud. Always too loud. The sound of footsteps approached from the corridor. Katie turned away from the lockers and moved toward the small refrigerator where the night shift nurses kept their half-empty coffee cups and labeled containers of leftovers. She pulled open the door, stared at the contents without seeing them, waited for the footsteps to pass. They did. She closed the refrigerator and exhaled, a measured breath that came from somewhere deep, somewhere trained. 30 seconds of nothing. That's all it took to compartmentalize. To bury. To become the quiet nurse who kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. The emergency department was starting to fill. Triage had called in a motor vehicle accident, 2 vehicles, multiple casualties expected within 15 minutes. Katie's hands moved on their own, checking crash carts, restocking supply bins, ensuring that everything the trauma surgeons would need sat ready in precise order. For needles organized by gauge. Airway supplies in descending size. Medications arranged alphabetically by generic name, not brand, because brand names didn't matter when you were trying to save someone's life. Her charting was meticulous. Every discrepancy noted. Every medication transaction logged with timestamps and witness signatures. She was very, very good at her job. Dr. Sterling arrived at 0745 and immediately made his way to the charge nurse's desk. Katie watched him from the corner of her vision as he picked up the incident report she'd filed. 3 sheets of paper. 3 billing inconsistencies. His jaw tightened visibly. He scanned the reports, then looked up, searching the emergency department. His eyes found Katie near the supply station, hands moving with precision as she restocked the defibrillator pads. He watched her for 6 seconds, she counted them without meaning to, muscle memory that came from reading threat assessment in the field. Then he turned back to the charge nurse. Where did these come from? His voice was low, but it carried. Katie Morrison. Nursing staff noticed the discrepancies during the auditing process. Sterling's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something calculating. He set the reports back on the desk with exaggerated care, the way someone might place a loaded gun on a table. Then he spoke, voice raised just enough that half the emergency department could hear. "You know, I think we should all take bets on how long she lasts here. I'm thinking 7 days. Anyone want to counter that?" The other physicians laughed. Not all of them. Dr. Okonkwo, one of the trauma surgeons, didn't join in. But her silence didn't matter. The laughter had already filled the space. Katie felt the tremor start in her hands. Just a tremor. Not a shake. Not visible unless you were looking very closely. She forced her fingers to continue their work, organizing the pads with the same precision she'd used to organize pre-surgical equipment in forward operating bases. Muscle memory was a strange thing. It could save your life or destroy it, depending on the circumstances. Right now, it was keeping her moving. Breath steady. Eyes forward. The tremor subsided after 4 seconds. The motor vehicle accident arrived at 0751. 2 vehicles. For patients. All ambulatory to critical condition. The emergency department transformed in the way it always did, trauma protocol activated, the organized chaos of emergency medicine unfolding like choreography. Katie moved through it, anticipated needs before they were voiced, positioned supplies and equipment with the certainty of someone who had done this in actual chaos, in the kind of environment where seconds didn't feel like seconds, where time became something else entirely. Her hands moved like surgical lasers, precise, unwavering, certain. By 0847, the immediate crisis had stabilized. 3 patients transferred to surgical bays. 1 admitted for observation. The emergency department returned to its normal state of controlled urgency. That was when the admission from the waiting area came through. A patient for room 304. 62-year-old male. Chest discomfort. EKG normal. Elevated troponin. The admitting diagnosis read like a typical case for cardiac observation. The handoff report was routine. Except for one detail that the admitting physician didn't mention, because he didn't know yet. The colonel, that's what everyone would call him, that's what his chart would identify him as, Colonel James Matthews, Delta Force, retired, was staring at something on Katie's chest as she performed her initial assessment. His eyes were fixed on her name badge. Katie noticed the way his pupils dilated slightly, the way his breathing changed, subtle and barely perceptible but present. She'd learned to read these signs in Sangin, learned to understand what a person's body was telling her before their mouth caught up. The colonel was trying to play something. A face. A name. A memory that wasn't quite forming. Katie kept her own expression neutral, professional, the mask of a nurse performing routine vitals. Blood pressure 138/86. Heart rate 92. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. She documented everything with the same meticulous accuracy she brought to every aspect of her work. "Have we met?" the colonel asked. His voice had the quality of someone reaching through fog. "No, sir," Katie said. It wasn't true. It was also completely accurate. They had met, yes, but that meeting had happened in a place and context that no longer existed. She had carried him through a minefield while sniper fire cracked the air above her head. She had done emergency field medicine under conditions that had no civilian equivalent. She had known his name then. But that was a different lifetime. A different version of Katie Morrison. This version just kept her eyes down and her voice level. "I'm assigned to your care for this shift." The colonel continued staring at her name badge, the confusion deepening in the lines around his eyes. He was trying to solve something. A puzzle with missing pieces. Katie finished her assessment, documented her findings, and moved toward the door with the same steady rhythm she maintained for everything. Professional. Efficient. Invisible. That was when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, blocking her path. He smiled at the colonel, not at Katie. The smile was the kind that revealed teeth but nothing else. "Don't worry, Colonel. We have excellent nurses here at Oak Creek. Though I should mention that the newest addition to our team might not be with us very long. We're betting she'll quit before the week is over." He laughed, a sound like gravel in a throat. "She doesn't seem to have the temperament for this line of work." The Colonel's expression shifted. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or the ghost of it. His hand moved slightly, as if reaching toward something he couldn't quite touch. His eyes found Katie's for the first time. Really looked at her. But Katie had already moved past Sterling, was already in the corridor, was already compartmentalizing the weight of that gaze the way she compartmentalized everything else. The tremor in her hands didn't start until she was back at the supply station, hands occupied with restocking crash cart supplies, fingers moving with precision while her mind did something very different. It processed threat levels. It measured distances. It calculated escape routes and contingencies. Old habits. Hardwired responses from situations where survival meant seeing the danger before it saw you. What happened next changed everything. But Katie didn't know that yet. Katie Morrison kept her eyes down as she walked through Oak Creek Memorial's emergency department that morning, the worn combat boots in her locker, the only tangible reminder of Sangin and the life she'd left behind, a secret she guarded as fiercely as her past. The boots were scuffed at the heel, one lace permanently frayed where shrapnel had caught it 8 years ago. She'd never replaced them. Some things, she'd learned, were worth keeping broken. The nurse's station erupted with laughter before she reached the charting desk. Dr. Sterling stood center stage, his silk tie catching the fluorescent light like a trophy. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Morrison here," he gestured toward her with theatrical disdain, loud enough for 6 nurses and 4 residents to hear clearly. "She's got until next Friday before reality sets in. Who's betting she makes it to day 6? He pulled out his phone, opening a notes app. "Palmer, Chen, I'm writing this down. You'll owe me $50 each when she walks out crying." The other physicians laughed. One, a cardiologist named Reeves, shook his head with amusement. "You're generous. I give her 3 days." Sterling's smile widened like a predator catching scent. He hadn't even glanced at Katie directly. That was the cruelty of it, she wasn't worth his full attention. Just another dismissible thing in a hallway full of important people. Katie set down her stack of patient charts and began reviewing overnight labs. Her hands didn't shake. Not yet. Composure was muscle memory, built across deployments where showing strain meant showing weakness, and weakness meant someone died. She'd carried men twice Sterling's weight through mortar fire in Sangin Valley, their blood soaking through her uniform, their breath coming in gasps she'd learned to interpret as precisely as vital signs. This was nothing. A physician with a God complex and board connections was nothing. But her jaw tightened. Just slightly. A microfracture in her armor that only appeared when she was working very hard to contain herself. 3 days later, Thursday afternoon, Katie stood in the hospital cafeteria holding her lunch tray, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee in a ceramic mug. The dining area was crowded at 12:30, maybe 20 staff scattered across tables. The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional song. A resident was telling a story about a difficult patient. Someone laughed. Sterling entered from the far entrance. He didn't see her at first. He was on his phone, gesturing with his free hand. But as he approached the beverage station, his eyes found her across the room the way a missile finds heat signature. She watched him calculate the angle. Katie didn't stop moving toward the exit. There was no reason to anticipate what was coming. No logic to it. Just a man with something to prove and a woman who'd stopped trying to predict civilian cruelty years ago. He pivoted hard from the beverage station. His shoulder caught the edge of her tray with brutal precision, not a stumble, not an accident. A collision measured and executed. Katie's tray tilted, the physics of it beautiful and terrible. The mug went first, hitting tile and shattering with a sound like a small gunshot. The sandwich followed. Soup splashed across her scrubs, hot enough to sting but not burn, the bowl rolling across the linoleum with a sound like a dropped compass. The room went dead silent. Sterling stepped back, his expression arranged into theatrical concern. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you there." His voice carried to every corner. "These hospital hallways. You have to watch where you're standing." He looked around at the assembled staff, at the nurses watching, at the residents pretending not to watch. "Clumsy," he said, and the word was a diagnosis. "Maybe nursing isn't for you. Some people just don't have the coordination for medical work." Katie knelt slowly to gather the debris. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd performed medical procedures under fire, who understood that trembling meant death. She gathered fragments of ceramic. The soup soaked into her uniform, cooling against her skin. Someone started to help. Sterling waved them back. "Let her. Good practice for the janitorial work she'll be doing when this doesn't work out." He picked up a stack of patient charts from the counter, her charts, the one she'd been reviewing, and dropped them deliberately at her feet. The paper scattered across tile like wounded birds. "Pick those up, sweetheart. Better get used to floor work." Katie remained on one knee for a breath. Just one. She let the moment exist in the space between cruelty and response. Then she stood, lifting her eyes to meet his. She took one measured breath, the same breath she'd taken 8 years ago when a mortar round had killed the man standing beside her, and she'd kept moving anyway because the wounded don't care about your fear. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. Her voice came out steady as stone, each word a separate thing, delivered with the precision of someone who'd called in air strikes under fire. "I've carried wounded men twice your weight through enemy fire." Her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear, though the room had leaned forward into the silence. "Your disrespect weighs nothing." Sterling's face reddened in increments. His jaw clenched. But something in her eyes, something ancient and dangerous that didn't belong in a hospital cafeteria, made him pause. For 3 seconds, he was a man who'd made a calculation error and suddenly wasn't sure of the math. "Quite the imagination," he said finally, his voice louder now, for the audience. "Stick to emptying bedpans, Morrison." He turned away with theatrical disgust. "Someone get housekeeping up here." The room exhaled. Conversations resumed. Katie gathered the charts from the floor, each one a small humiliation, each movement controlled. A nurse from the ICU, Rodriguez, someone Katie knew by sight if not by name, touched her shoulder. Katie nodded once, a gesture that meant thank you and please don't, all in one silent vocabulary built in wars. That evening, Katie was retrieving labs from the pneumatic tube system when she noticed something new taped to the bulletin board in the physician's lounge. A handwritten chart. "Morrison quits by Friday, Palmer, $50. Monday, Reeves, $50. Wednesday, Dr. Chen, $50. Never, Sterling, $100, not really." Katie's hands trembled for the first time since Afghanistan. The pencil marks were casual. The bets ranged from $50 to the $100 Sterling had written in. It was a pool. A fucking betting pool on how long it would take for them to destroy her. She photographed it with her phone, her hands barely steady enough to frame the shot. Then she deleted the photo. Then she took it again. Then she sat in the supply room for 7 minutes with the door closed, her back against industrial shelving, breathing in the smell of sterile gauze and antiseptic solution, letting her hands shake where no one could see them. That night, parked in her car in the hospital lot at 2,200 hours, Katie sat with her phone glowing. Her mother had texted 4 times in the past week. "Mom, honey, when are you coming home? Dad wants to know about your leave dates. Mom, the church is doing a military family dinner Friday. Would love to surprise them with your visit. Mom, call me when you can. Miss you. Mom, are you okay?" Katie stared at the messages. Her mother still believed she was deployed overseas. Katie had told her that in the early days, a story that had seemed safe then but now felt like a monument to cowardice. She'd been discharged 8 months ago due to PTSD, the nightmares so violent that she couldn't trust herself in a medical emergency, couldn't trust her hands not to shake. She'd chosen anonymity in civilian nursing specifically because she needed to heal without anyone knowing, without the weight of who she'd been crushing the woman she was trying to become. Her husband Tom's contact photo was still in her phone. Tom in dress blues, taken 3 years ago, 2 months before he died in Sangin. She'd learned about it through a casualty officer at 0300 hours, and it had taken exactly 1 minute for her to understand that the day she'd earned her Navy Cross, the day she'd carried Colonel James Matthews through a minefield while taking sniper fire, her legs screaming, her lungs burning, the world exploding around her, that same day, Tom's world had ended. She'd never told anyone about Tom. Not the hospital intake form. Not the psychiatric evaluation. Not the therapist who'd recommended civilian work. She'd buried him in her own silence and expected that to be enough. Katie set the phone down on her lap without responding. The parking lot stretched out before her, empty as a battlefield after the fighting stopped. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sterling's calculations were working. She could feel it in the way other staff members now hesitated before approaching her, the way conversation stopped when she entered the break room, the way the nursing director, Patricia Wells, who'd hired her with a smile, had started finding reasons to pull her aside. Sterling was building something. A case. A narrative. By morning, Katie understood what was happening. He'd already made calls. To board members. To the nursing director. To anyone with power who owed him favors. At 0300 hours Friday morning, Katie was reviewing Colonel Matthews's overnight chart when his monitor alarmed. The Delta Force officer in room 304 had been admitted with chronic pericardial effusion 3 days ago, a slow accumulation of fluid around his heart that required surgical intervention. But something had shifted in those 3 days. The fluid wasn't slow anymore. It was accelerating. His breathing had changed. His pressure was dropping. Katie was moving toward his room before the second alarm sounded. Katie's hands moved across Colonel Matthews's chart with the precision of someone reading tactical intelligence. Room 304. 2:27 a.m. The graveyard shift stretched empty and quiet around her, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of pale that made even healthy people look sick. She'd learned to move through these hours like smoke, present but unnoticed, which was exactly how she preferred it. The billing codes caught her first. Captain 93,000. Captain 93,005. Echocardiograms ordered on consecutive days for a patient who'd already had a comprehensive cardiac workup in the first 48 hours. The codes themselves weren't unusual. The asterisk pattern asterisk was. She pulled the supply orders tethered to each procedure and saw them, kickback arrangements with Cardiac Solutions Unlimited. A company she'd never heard of. A company, she realized as she dug deeper into the hospital's vendor database, that had Dr. Sterling's brother-in-law listed as regional director. Her jaw tightened. Not from anger. From recognition. She'd seen this before. Different uniforms, different circumstances, but the same fundamental corruption, people with access exploiting systems built on trust. In Sangin, it had been supply sergeants skimming combat rations meant for forward patrols. Here, it was a physician padding procedures to justify expensive equipment that generated commission payments. The methodology was identical. The only difference was the body count remained invisible. Katie cross-referenced the dates. Sterling had ordered 3 unnecessary procedures on the colonel in the first 72 hours of admission. 3 procedures generating approximately $14,000 in direct billing, with an estimated $2,100 in kickbacks funneling back through the vendor company. She pulled his previous patients. The pattern repeated. Cardiac patients admitted under Sterling's care showed 34% higher procedural rates than the hospital average. The statistical deviation was so obvious it felt personal, like watching someone steal from a donation plate. She documented everything. A small voice inside her, the one that had gotten her through EOD training and 3 tours in the Helmand province, whispered that she should stop. That documentation meant visibility. Visibility meant standing up. Standing up meant ending the anonymity she'd purchased with her silence. But there was another voice, older and louder, that had made Senior Chief Petty Officer because she couldn't look away from broken systems any more than she could stop breathing. The Colonel's chart updated at 3:14 a.m. New vitals. Elevated heart rate. Respiratory rate climbing. Systolic pressure dropping in incremental steps like a countdown. Katie scrolled through the imaging notes from his afternoon echocardiogram, the unnecessary one Sterling had ordered despite a perfectly adequate study from admission. The report mentioned trace pericardial effusion. Recommend clinical monitoring. The radiologist had written it in that professional shorthand that meant, not urgent, recheck in a week. But vital signs didn't care about radiologist recommendations. They told their own story. Katie pulled up the trend graph and watched the Colonel's numbers deteriorate in real time, each measurement a breadcrumb leading somewhere darker. His systolic pressure had been 118 on admission. 115 at shift change. Now 102. Dropping like a stone down a well. Pericardial fluid accumulating. Her mind moved through the physiology with automatic precision, the thin sac surrounding the heart filling, pressure building, the chambers beginning to collapse under the weight of their own protection. Tamponade wasn't subtle. It was a death sentence in slow motion, written in declining blood pressure and muffled heart sounds and the specific terror of a body that couldn't fill itself with oxygen no matter how hard it tried. She stood and moved toward his room before consciously deciding to move, that old instinct overriding the part of her that wanted to stay invisible. The worn combat boots in her locker, the one she'd kept despite everything, the one Sterling had seen once and asked with that particular sneer if she was planning a camping trip, suddenly felt like they were calling to her from room 304. That tattoo on the Colonel's forearm. Morrison. Her name written in ink on a man she'd carried through gunfire in a place where the heat came off the ground like a living thing and death arrived without warning. The monitor's rhythm changed at 3:27 a.m. One alarm, then cascading. Katie was through the doorway before the second one sounded, before the reality of what was happening could catch up to the part of her that had spent 12 years knowing what those sounds meant. The Colonel's color had shifted to that particular shade of gray that meant the body was shutting down, rationing oxygen to the brain while peripheral tissues died in silence. His lips held a faint blue tinge. Jugular veins distended like cords pulled tight across his neck. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one costing him effort that registered in the way his ribs pulled against his skin. Katie didn't need to check the monitors to know the numbers. She could read it in the architecture of his body, the language of compensation and collapse written in physiology instead of words. She keyed the overhead intercom. Stat page to Dr. Reinhard, on-call surgeon. Cardiac tamponade protocol. Room 304. The operator's voice crackled back. Dr. Reinhard is in emergency appendectomy in OR2. He's unavailable. How long? Approximately 25 minutes. His resident is scrubbed in. 25 minutes. The Colonel's systolic pressure was 82 and falling. Katie's mind calculated the mathematics of collapse, blood pressure dropping approximately 2 to 3 points per minute based on current trajectory. That placed cardiac arrest somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes. The surgical team needed 25. The gap between those two numbers was where he would die. The charge nurse appeared in the doorway, confusion and uncertainty etched into her posture. Katie, what do you need? Before Katie could answer, Dr. Sterling materialized behind her like something that had been waiting for the invitation. His eyes moved across the monitors with clinical assessment, then to Katie with something that looked like satisfaction. Morrison, step away from the patient. His voice carried that particular tone, the one that had announced a losing bet to the entire nursing station. You're not qualified for this level of care. I'm reassigning you to the pediatric floor effective immediately. Katie didn't acknowledge him. Her eye stayed on the Colonel's monitors. BP 70 over 40 and falling. The numbers glowed in accusation and urgency and something else, something that felt like an open door she'd been waiting 12 years to walk through. "He'll be dead in 5 minutes without intervention," Katie said quietly. "I gave you an order." Sterling's voice hardened, each word a statement of dominance. "Leave this room now or I'm calling security. Consider this your final written warning." He stepped sideways, positioning himself between Katie and the crash cart with the deliberate slowness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The charge nurse still stood frozen in the doorway. The monitors continued their descent. The colonel's eyes fluttered once, consciousness slipping like water through fingers. Katie looked at that tattoo. Morrison. Her name worn on his skin. And something broke open inside her, not the fragile, careful structure of anonymity she'd built, but something older and harder. 12 years of Sangin compressed into a single moment. All the men she'd carried when the compound took fire. All the hours of silence and scrubs and staying small. All the reasons she'd walked away, arranged like bones in a tomb. She moved. Not around Sterling. Through him, past him, her shoulder connecting with his chest in motion that carried absolute authority. Not a request. A displacement. Her hands found the ultrasound unit with muscle memory that belonged to another life, another name, another identity that had been waiting in that locker with those combat boots. "You're joking," Sterling said, voice rising. "Security. I need security in room 304 immediately." Katie positioned the transducer over the colonel's precordium without hesitation. The image resolved in grayscale. Pericardial sac distended with fluid, the heart chambers compressed against it like a fist squeezing a sponge. Tamponade. Clinical. Obvious. Lethal. She reached for the pericardiocentesis kit and opened it with movements that belonged to a field hospital in Helmand Province, not to Oak Creek Memorial in San Diego. 20-gauge needle. Syringe. The specific angle between the ribs that allowed access without puncturing the lung or coronary artery. "This is hospital protocol violation," Sterling shouted. "I'm documenting this as an authorized procedure." "You're finished here, Morrison." "Finished?" Katie didn't respond. Her hands moved into position, the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the landmarks of emergency intervention burned into muscle memory by training and repetition and the weight of lives depending on precision. The colonel's eyes opened slightly, meeting hers with something that looked like recognition and relief. The needle advanced. Her breathing steady. Her hand steady. Everything outside the frame of this procedure falling away, Sterling's voice, the charge nurse's gasp, the weight of every consequence she'd been hiding from for 12 years. Dark blood filled the syringe. Rich and dark and immediate. The pericardial fluid that had been suffocating his heart released. The monitors shifted from collapse into something resembling balance. The pressure alarm that had been screaming its warning finally quieted. Sinus rhythm appeared on the screen. The colonel's color began its slow return from gray to something closer to alive. Sterling's voice had stopped. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching a timid nurse become something else entirely, someone whose hands moved with the precision of a combat medic, whose voice had just dropped an octave into commands instead of apologies, whose competence revealed itself like a weapon being drawn from concealment. The monitor's alarm screamed like a predator that had found its prey. Katie's eyes snapped to the numbers, blood pressure 70/40 and dropping. 70. 68. The colonel's jugular veins distended like ropes straining against his neck. Muffled heart sounds, the telltale sign that fluid was compressing his heart, stealing its ability to beat with any force. Cardiac tamponade. Acute. Catastrophic. 0300 hours, and the on-call surgeon was 23 minutes away. Dr. Sterling stood at the doorway, his mouth opening. "We need to wait for..." Katie was already moving. Not toward the phone. Not toward Sterling. Toward the crash cart, muscle memory moving faster than conscious thought, her hands reaching for the pericardiocentesis kit like she'd done this 400 times before, which, in Sangin province under mortar fire, she had. Her fingers found the 18-gauge needle, the fall line, the drainage catheter. No hesitation. No permission asked. Morrison, step back from that patient. Sterling's voice had lost its certainty, replaced by something that sounded like panic disguised as authority. She didn't acknowledge him. The room had narrowed to 12 feet by 14 feet and one man whose heart was drowning in blood. She prepped the colonel's chest with chlorhexidine in 4 controlled circles, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done emergency procedures in darkness and chaos. Her posture shifted, no longer the deferential nurse who accepted insults in silence. This was someone else. Someone who had learned medicine the way some people learn languages, by necessity under fire. The needle goes between the ribs, she said quietly, not to Sterling, not to anyone. To herself. To the muscle memory that lived in her hands. 5th intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Slow. You feel the resistance of the pericardium. Then it gives. The needle slid in. No tremor. No doubt. Her left hand steadied the colonel's chest while her right hand guided the needle between his 4th and 5th ribs with the precision of a surgeon placing a suture on a human hair. The sound was minimal, just the soft resistance of tissue yielding to steel, and then the hiss of air as negative pressure collapsed around the needle. Blood poured into the catheter. Dark blood. Ancient blood. 80 cubic centimeters of it, thick as motor oil, pooling into the collection chamber with the color of rust. 40 cubic centimeters extracted. The colonel's shoulders relaxed slightly, oxygen beginning to reach tissue starved of it. 60 cubic centimeters. His color was returning, the gray-white of near death giving way to something closer to human again. 80 cubic centimeters. The final pulls of the syringe met resistance. Empty. The pericardium was decompressed. Katie withdrew the needle with the same precision she had inserted it. One smooth motion. The fall line secured. A pressure dressing taped across the access site. The monitors sang a different song now. The heart rate dropped from 147 to 118. Oxygen saturation climbed, 72%. 78%. 84%. Blood pressure crept upward, 80/45. 82/48. The sinus rhythm stabilized into something steady, something alive, something that meant the colonel would see dawn. The on-call surgeon, Dr. Chen, pushed through the doors at 0327, 16 minutes faster than his ETA. He stopped at the bedside, taking in the scene, the colonel's pink cheeks, the steady monitors, the professional dressing on the patient's left chest, the drainage catheter already being monitored. His eyes found Katie's for exactly 2 seconds. That was textbook, he said quietly. Who? Unauthorized procedure. Sterling's voice had become a weapon again, sharp and precise. Reckless endangerment. Invasion of a physician's scope of practice. I want this documented. Now. Before the next shift change. Dr. Chen looked from Katie to Sterling to the colonel. Then back to the monitors. The patient is stable. The procedure was executed with surgical precision. I'm not documenting unauthorized anything. But Sterling was already moving, his phone rising to his ear before his shoes left the tile. Board Chairman Palmer at 03 for 2 hours. I need to discuss a serious staffing concern. Yes, I know the hour. This is urgent. Palmer, who received $200,000 in referrals annually from Sterling's side ventures. Palmer, who answered on the second ring. Board Member Chen at 03 for 7 hours. We need to talk about your son's situation. The one I buried with a medical emergency letter. Chen's breathing audible over the phone, understanding blooming in the silence. The State Nursing Board investigator at 0351 hours. I'm calling to report a dangerously unstable nurse with probable PTSD and possible substance abuse issues. Yes, the same woman we discussed at the club. She just performed an invasive procedure without authorization on a critical patient. The external patient safety consultant was brought in by 0500 Hours, a woman whose research funding depended on Sterling's hospital connections. She spent 47 minutes reviewing the chart, interviewing Sterling and 2 nurses he had prepped with talking points, and writing an incident report that called the pericardiocentesis a dangerous deviation from protocol and Katie an immediate threat to patient safety. Katie worked her shift. She changed the colonel's dressings at 0600 Hours. She checked his vitals at 0900 and 1200, each time finding him more awake, more present, more alive. He watched her with those confused eyes, recognition without memory, like trying to remember a dream after waking. She didn't speak. Just documented. Just monitored. Just existed in the space she had carved out with 12 years of service and the determination to be nobody. The nursing director, Maria Reeves, was pale when she called Katie into her office at 1400 Hours. Maria was decent. Kind, even. But she was also terrified of Sterling, of the board members already circling, of the investigation already launched. Her hands trembled as she slid the termination paperwork across her desk. "I'm so sorry, Katie." Maria's voice was thin as paper. "The board has decided, given the unauthorized invasive procedure, Dr. Sterling's documented concerns about your fitness for duty, and the state investigation already initiated, we have to let you go. Effective immediately." Katie read the paperwork. Fitness for duty. Psychological evaluation recommended. Unable to follow protocol. The words were precision tools designed to break her, to make her believe she had done wrong, to erase the memory of a man's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 94% under her hands. She folded the papers. Placed them on the desk. Understood. Security was waiting in the hallway. Not hostile. Just present. A man named Rodriguez who had always been kind, who now looked at his shoes as he walked her toward her locker. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, staff members turning away, one nurse pressing her hand against her chest, another beginning to cry. Sterling stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed, his expression somewhere between victory and confusion, like he had won but couldn't understand why he didn't feel better. Her locker was the third one from the corner. Inside were her personal items, 3 shifts worth of extra scrubs, hand lotion, a granola bar she'd forgotten about. And at the bottom, the pair of worn combat boots. Tan leather, creased from 847 missions in dust and heat and sand. The soles were thin. The laces were frayed. They smelled like cordite and memory. Rodriguez handed her a cardboard box. "I'm sorry, Ms. Morrison." She placed the boots inside, on top of everything else. Picked up the box. Walked out past the main entrance where the San Diego evening was beginning to bruise the sky with purple. Where rain had started to fall and was falling harder, coming down like it had something to prove. Tom's grave was in Miramar Cemetery, 8.3 miles from Oak Creek Memorial. Katie sat in her car for a long moment before driving, her clothes soaking through because she didn't bother with a jacket. The rain didn't matter. The mud soaking through the knees of her scrubs didn't matter. The sound of the cardboard box sliding across the wet cemetery grass as she carried it to his headstone didn't matter. She knelt in the mud. Placed the box beside the granite. Pressed her palm against the stone, her fingers tracing his name, Thomas Edward Morrison, 1987 to 2010, beloved husband, EOD technician, Navy. The rain was so heavy now that the world had narrowed to this, her and Tom, and 48 hours of having saved a life twice and having lost everything in the process. "I failed again," she whispered. The words were barely audible over the rain. "I saved him in Sangin when you died. I saved him again last night. And I still lost everything. I can't keep pretending I'm okay, Tom. I can't." Lightning split the sky open above the cemetery. She didn't notice the black sedan pulling into the parking lot 200 yards away. She didn't see the woman in navy dress uniform, captain's bars catching the lightning, walking toward the administrator's office at Oak Creek Memorial with a classified service record in her hand. She didn't know that the colonel had opened his eyes fully at 1,257 hours and whispered a single word to the nurse filing paperwork, a word that made the nurse's hand shake, a word that meant everything was about to change. That word, phantom. Security's footsteps echoed through the employee corridor at 1,400 hours on a Tuesday. Katie Morrison walked 3 steps ahead of the guard, her badge already surrendered, her hands holding a cardboard box that weighed almost nothing and everything simultaneously. Inside, a stethoscope that had heard the heartbeats of wounded men across 3 continents, a water bottle with a faded 160th SAW emblem, and at the very bottom, the pair of worn combat boots she'd promised herself she'd never touch again. The guard's expression was carefully neutral. He'd escorted plenty of people out. None of them had saved a life in the trauma bay at 03 for 7 hours that same morning. The automatic doors slid open and rain hammered the parking lot like gunfire. Katie stood in the deluge for a moment, letting it soak through her scrubs, soaking her socks, turning the asphalt beneath her boots into dark mirrors. Her car was parked in the back row where she always parked, invisible, forgettable. She placed the cardboard box on the passenger seat and sat motionless behind the wheel, water dripping from her hair onto the steering column. 48 hours. That's how long it took to save a life and lose everything. She drove through the rain without music, without the radio, just the rhythmic percussion of the storm against the windshield wipers. By 16:30 hours, she was standing at the San Diego National Cemetery in Mission Valley, her uniform replaced by civilian clothes that fit like borrowed skin. The grass was slick and sucked at her shoes. Plot 847G. Her late husband Thomas Morrison. 1987 to 2015. Killed in action, Sangin Valley, Helmand Province. The same valley where she'd pulled him out of a Taliban ambush, the same valley where she'd held pressure on a wound that wouldn't close, the same valley where he'd bled out in her arms while she whispered his name like it was a prayer that could rewrite physics. She knelt in the mud. Rain soaked through her jeans. Her voice came out hoarse, fractured, the sound of someone who'd been holding her composure for 48 hours straight and finally reached the end of the rope. I failed again, Tom. I saved his life. Twice. And I still lost everything. The rain offered no answer. The stone offered no comfort. Somewhere in San Diego, a man named Dr. Sterling was probably celebrating, probably thinking about his board member contacts, probably believing he'd won. Katie had saved a colonel from death and lost her career doing it. In the calculus of institutions, she was the mistake. Sterling was the system. But at 1,257 hours that same day, 1 hour before the Pentagon's call would arrive, Colonel James Matthews had opened his eyes in his hospital bed and stared at the termination paperwork a nurse was filing. His vision was still blurred from the sedation, his chest still bound tight with monitoring leads, his heart still deciding whether it wanted to keep beating. But his mind was clear enough to read one name, Katie Morrison. And clear enough to remember. He whispered a single word that made the nurse's hand shake so badly she nearly dropped the clipboard. Phantom. That was the call sign. Not her military rank, not her official designation. Phantom. What the men in her unit called her because she could move through hostile territory without being seen, could appear in a kill zone with medical supplies when everyone else was pinned down, could extract wounded soldiers from places that were supposed to be impossible. Phantom. A name that had no hospital badge, no civilian credentials, no record in any civilian database. A name that belonged to someone who'd been dead for 7 years. The colonel's daughter arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 1,445 hours. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Matthews wore her dress uniform with the same precision her father had taught her, and she entered the nurse's station like she was conducting a boarding action. Her eyes found the duty nurse first, then swept the entire department, landing finally on the termination paperwork still visible on a desk someone had forgotten to file away. Who fired a senior chief petty officer? The question wasn't loud. That was what made it devastating. It was the kind of quiet that comes from absolute certainty of authority. The nurses exchanged glances. The duty nurse, a young woman named Rodriguez, cleared her throat. The patient in 304. My father. Colonel James Matthews. And I'm going to need to know exactly who authorized his physician to interfere with his medical care. Within 90 minutes, the hospital's legal counsel had pulled Katie's full-service file from the Navy's classified database. By 1600 hours, the FBI had contacted Administrator Vargas. By 1630 hours, a SEAL team leader named Clayton Mercer arrived at the hospital in dress blues, his chest a topography of decorations that had been earned in places that didn't appear on maps. He walked into the colonel's room and saw Katie's name on the termination letter, and his jaw clenched so tight you could have hung a weight from it. I need to debrief with Senior Chief Morrison. Right now. The nurse at the station made an error in judgment. She's no longer employed here. Clayton Mercer's eyes moved to her with the focused precision of a targeting laser. Then we need to find her. Where does she live? Katie was sitting in her apartment on Elm Street, staring at a wall that had never changed and never would, when her phone rang at 1847 hours. It was a number she didn't recognize. Senior Chief Morrison. Who is this? Lieutenant Commander Clayton Mercer, SEAL Team 3. Colonel Matthews asked me to tell you that you're not finished yet. You need to come back to the hospital. Now. 15 minutes later, Katie walked through the emergency department of Oak Creek Memorial and found herself surrounded by men and women in dress uniform. Captain Rodriguez. Chief Petty Officer Holloway. A major from Joint Special Operations Command. And standing at the center of them all, Colonel Matthews in a wheelchair because his chest was still healing but his spine was straight and his eyes were focused entirely on Katie. His daughter stepped forward first. Senior Chief, my father wanted you to understand something. His memory might be damaged. His body's healing. But he never forgot you. He's worn your name on his arm for 7 years because you were the last thing he consciously knew before he lost consciousness in Sangin. Clayton Mercer moved to Katie's side, and his voice carried the weight of someone reading commendations. Navy Cross. Awarded for extraordinary heroism in Sangin Valley. You stayed in the kill zone after your unit withdrew. You provided medical care to 3 wounded Marines under sustained fire. 2 of them made it home because of you. He paused. The silence was so thick you could have operated in it. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat wounds sustained during the same engagement. You continued combat operations despite those wounds. Medical evacuation not requested until all casualties were stabilized. Another pause. Silver Star. Awarded for carrying Colonel James Matthews through a known minefield while under sniper fire. Your medical knowledge saved his life in the field. Your actions under fire saved his life in motion. You made it out. He made it out. Both of you made it home. Katie's hands, which had been rock-steady while pulling fluid from around a dying man's heart, began to move. Not trembling. Something else. Something like the slight adjustment a archer makes drawing a bow, a sniper settling into position, a musician recognizing that the symphony was about to begin. Why are you telling me this? Her voice had changed. The civilian hesitancy was gone. What remained was the voice of someone who'd given orders to men and women in places where hesitation meant death. Because, Clayton Mercer said quietly, 2 hours ago, the Federal Bureau of Investigation contacted this hospital. They have Dr. Sterling on a wiretap discussing billing fraud dating back 37 months. The amount we're discussing is $847,000 in phantom procedures, inflated charges, and direct kickbacks from medical supply vendors. And they have his emails where he discusses, explicitly, his plan to fabricate disciplinary charges against you because your charting revealed his scheme. FBI agents arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 1912 hours. Not local bureau, NCIS with federal authority. They walked directly to Dr. Sterling's office and found him staring at his phone, the color draining from his face with each text that arrived. Board Chairman Palmer had just resigned. Board member Chen's lawyer was sending severance termination letters. The state nursing board had informed him that an investigation into harassment of a decorated veteran was opening, with federal jurisdiction. His hands shook as he tried to call Palmer. The call went to voicemail. Then Chen. Voicemail. Then the external patient safety consultant who'd written the initial report. "I'm not going to be party to this," the consultant said quietly. "And I'm recommending to the medical board that my original report be filed under fraud investigation." Sterling slumped in his chair when the FBI agents knocked. At 1347 hours the next morning, Administrator Vargas personally delivered Sterling's termination notice. Not through HR. Not through legal counsel. Personally. His office. His voice steady as a surgical laser. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Federal investigators are waiting in the adjacent conference room. You will not access any hospital systems. You will not contact any staff member. Legal counsel is present. The hospital has concluded that your actions constitute gross misconduct, fraud, and attempted obstruction of medical care." Sterling tried one final play. His voice was like a man trying to argue his way out of gravity. "You have no proof that my procedures were phantom. Morrison's procedure was still unauthorized. She violated protocol. She." The hospital's attorney cut him off with the efficiency of a guillotine blade. Senior Chief Morrison performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with textbook precision under acute life-threatening circumstances. That procedure saved Colonel Matthews's life. You, doctor, attempted to prevent appropriate medical care while simultaneously operating a fraud scheme that her meticulous charting threatened to expose. We have 37 emails proving you fabricated her disciplinary case. We have your communications with board members discussing how to eliminate the liability. This hospital's legal position is unambiguous. You committed fraud. You obstructed care. You attempted to retaliate against a whistleblower. I suggest you speak to your personal attorney before the next sentence you utter." Security appeared at the office door. The same guard who had escorted Katie out 48 hours earlier, carrying an identical cardboard box. His face was stone. No judgment. No satisfaction. Just the absolute certainty of someone executing a decision that had already been made by forces far larger than any individual's pride. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling's hand shook as he emptied his desk. Medical licenses framed on the wall. Diplomas that suddenly meant nothing. 20 years of credentialing that had just become radioactive. He walked past the nurses' station and watched as nurses who had laughed at his jokes yesterday turned away without acknowledgement. He walked past the cafeteria where he'd humiliated Katie Morrison in front of 40 staff members. He walked past the residence lounge where someone was erasing the betting board, the one that had predicted her departure within a week. One of the residents slowly wiped the erasable marker strokes away without speaking. Sterling's phone began buzzing before he even reached the parking lot. Colleagues distancing themselves. Friends who suddenly had no availability. His lawyer with preliminary estimates of legal fees that would require him to sell his house. By 1800 hours, the story had spread through the San Diego medical community like infection through a wound. By midnight, medical boards in 3 states had received notification. By morning, his malpractice insurance company had informed him that coverage would be terminated pending investigation. 6 months later, Katie Morrison returned to Oak Creek Memorial as a guest, not staff. Colonel Matthews walked beside her without assistance now, his chest still healing but his presence restored. The emergency department had changed. There was a new plaque on the wall, the Morrison Combat Medicine Training Fund, established by a grant from Colonel Matthews's foundation. And beside that plaque, a shadow box containing a photograph of Katie in dress uniform, navy dress blues with decorations visible even in still frame, and beneath that photograph, the pair of worn combat boots, no longer hidden in a locker but displayed like a saint's relics. Katie stood before the photograph and felt the weight of 7 years finally settling into a place where it belonged, not on her shoulders, but beside her, acknowledged, named, real. Colonel Matthews placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture was simple. The meaning was oceanic. You saved my life in Sangin. I didn't know it was you. Just knew someone pulled me out. That's why I got the tattoo, Morrison, on my forearm. I needed to remember. Needed to carry the name of whoever gave me 7 more years I didn't think I'd have. Katie's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. I couldn't save him. Couldn't save Tom. No. But you saved me. And the 15 others. And every patient you'll heal from this day forward. He paused. Phantom was always about more than moving through hostile territory unseen. It was about appearing exactly when people needed you most. A resident approached nervously to ask about combat medicine techniques. Katie answered with quiet authority, the trembling hands finally steady, the hidden knowledge finally recognized. She explained the principles of field triage, the decision trees for life or death choices, the mathematics of hemorrhage control when you had minutes instead of hours. The resident listened like he was receiving doctrine from the burning bush. Elsewhere in San Diego, Dr. Sterling taught CPR basics to bored community college students for $18 per hour, his medical license permanently revoked, his house in foreclosure, his fraud trial scheduled for next month. He'd been reduced to the exact opposite of what he'd always believed, a man with credentials but no authority, certifications but no respect, the kind of competence that institutions could strip away in 48 hours once the veneer of institutional protection was removed. Katie thought of him only once, when a nurse mentioned his name and Katie simply nodded and moved to her next patient. The colonel had asked her to keep those worn combat boots in her locker because some things, he said, were worth remembering. Some people were worth keeping as reminders. At shift change, Katie sat in the hospital chapel, no longer hiding her uniform under civilian scrubs. A young nurse with hollow eyes and shaking hands sat in the back pew. Katie recognized that look. The invisible wounds. The weight that civilians never learned how to measure. Katie sat beside her without asking permission. Afghanistan or Iraq? Katie's voice was barely above a whisper. The nurse's eyes widened. How did you? Katie gestured toward the visible shadow box, toward the photograph in dress uniform, toward the boots that no longer needed to be hidden. You're not alone. And you do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. The nurse began to cry, and Katie simply sat with her in the silence that only those who'd been broken and rebuilt understood, while outside the chapel, Oak Creek Memorial continued saving lives in ways that couldn't always be measured in vital signs. Hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying this. And I'm always curious, drop a comment and tell us if you're watching from a big city or a small town. Now let's continue the story.